Well, so what we're going to do, I'm going to turn it over to Hans Schmitz now to discuss a little bit about NC3, and then we'll have a bit of a panel discussion. So Hans, go ahead.
All right, thank you very much. I wanted, before I shared my screen and went over to the website, to let you all know that North Central Climate Collaborative is currently an extension-led initiative within the North Central states, a 12-state region. We do internal calls every other month. So if you are an extension professional and you'd like to join us, just email myself or Laura Edwards, and we'll get you added. We also have some externally facing material. And this is our website. The site will highlight, generally speaking, our next event, which is currently going on, and then our most recent event, which we do have a webinar generally every other month throughout the year. And those webinars are part of the learning opportunities here in the subpage, and they are also archived in the resources subpage. And you'll see that we've got a bit of a history of getting those webinars accomplished with some pretty timely topics. You can also connect with us. We do have all of, well, not all of our representatives, but at least a couple per state that we've tried to identify listed on the website here. And there are some states that have more than a couple of representatives, so they may not be all listed there, but you can identify someone from your state and reach out in that way. This is a 201 training, so I won't go into the Climate Foundations page. That's a very 101 high-level look at things. But we do also have additional resources that we've tried to aggregate over time, national, regional, or state-based. And you see kind of what that looks like here. So with that general overview, it is northcentralclimate.org if you want to head over and check things out yourself. And the June, we would normally have a June webinar. This is going to count as our June activity, and we'll start those webinars back up again in August. So I'll stop talking with that.
Okay, it's back to me then. So so this time we're going to plan on wrapping up at about quarter till. So we have about 20 minutes here left, and we just kind of wanted to open it up for an open discussion with the folks in the audience. If you have any comments or questions that were sparked by yesterday's talks, if you can remember back to yesterday, you heard from two really great speakers and me, and then today's talks, which were really fabulous. So if there are any sort of questions, or again, I want to follow up comments on anything, please feel free to type them into the chat and the Q&A. Oh, Laura has raised her hand, so she can have the floor.
I just wanted to maybe start off with one thing that's been on my mind here today, listening about equity. And, I know there are maybe a handful of people on the call who are from tribal lands or work with tribal groups and climate preparedness and planning. And we really tried to find a speaker, a segment on that here for this workshop, and we struck out several times. So we didn't ignore that. We really tried to do that. And I know here in South Dakota, there are several groups and tribes that are working hard on climate adaptation planning locally. And I know there's some great examples of that across the North Central region. So I just wanted to highlight that it wasn't an oversight. We know it's out there. And I'm sure we'll bring it back for our next workshop for sure. And our next opportunity with this group.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. Yeah, so I'll open it up here. Like I said, if there's any sort of questions or comments anybody has about anything that they've heard, or if you weren't maybe able, we didn't have time to ask a presenter a question or any in a panelist or anything like that. If I don't get any, I'm going to have to pick on somebody. So. All right, I'm gonna have to come up with one on my own. I did have, something that was interesting to me throughout the last couple of days has been this discussion of sort of political will in different places. So we may, like we heard from Rebecca and Lisa, we have, municipalities where the person who's in charge of planning, for example, may or may not have the political will to discuss climate change explicitly. Compared to maybe larger urban areas where that's there. And then we think about individual states. So I think Melissa talked about this a little bit about, perspectives from Indiana versus a state where, at the state level, there may be more apt to have discussions about climate change, like, for example, here in Illinois. And so I kind of wanted to open this up to, the audience, feel free to participate in this and your perspectives as well, but certainly the panelists of, your thoughts about how, your work, most of us are communicating climate, working with stakeholders in some way, shape, or form, and thinking about your experiences, maybe some strategies to try to, transcend that issue of political will to make sure that business gets done, that we are making our states more resilient to issues that we're seeing.
Trent, I'm going to comment on that. And one thing that I'll say is that these don't, that having influence and building up the political will or supporting those types of conversations don't happen overnight. And so having longstanding relationships and being that trusted source of information over time as that trusted scientific source is really invaluable. And I think, we often get groups who all of a sudden they're newly funded, they're really excited, they're ready to come into this space and be the authority on some issue. And that's great. We need new streams of funding and new groups, but that doesn't mean that they're going to have the ears of folks who are in charge and making decisions. And so I know everybody's busy with their day job. Everybody has all these tasks at hand, but really that science communication to the public, that science communication to your policymakers, and those connections take time. And so, finding ways to prioritize that and to build in that FaceTime or Zoom time or whatever it might be with your lawmakers, with your representatives. So when they say, we have a question, for example, in Indiana about stormwater management, and we need somebody to come talk about this, they think, oh, I've heard somebody talk about climate having some kind of impact on water. Maybe I'll call those people at Purdue and see if they can tell us about that, whereas maybe they wouldn't have done that before. So just reiterating that point that it's important to be building these relationships when maybe they're not at the forefront of the news, because that's going to be useful. That's been our experience here in Indiana.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Melissa. And I think that can't be overstated, that working with communities, being a trusted source of information is really key. Was there anybody else, panelists or audience, who wanted to share perspective? We do have a question, if not. Then I'll move to, Thomas Mace asked the question and answer about carbon pricing and addressed among constituent communities. I guess we don't necessarily, unless somebody wants to self-appoint, I don't really know of any expert on carbon pricing among the panelists. Aaron Wilson from Ohio is unmuting. So Aaron, are you?
Yeah, so I can talk about this a little bit. I think what we've seen, obviously, with carbon markets and carbon pricing, and is typical in the private industry, is often a lot more nimble than the university, right? And so, and there's a lot of different reasons for that. There's from good information to misinformation and everything in between, right? And we have this certain peer review process within the university foundation versus what can be done outside. I think right now, and some of the things that I'm thinking about is that, carbon management, carbon pricing is actually a great theme that can centralize and really bring us together in terms of building that trust, right? So we've got largely a community out there that's wondering, okay, which company do I go with? Which company do I the things that they're telling me, how can I trust the message that's coming from this company A, company B, et cetera? So I think that there's an opportunity here within the extension community to bring some clarity and to bring some truth about what we know and what we don't know from carbon management and carbon pricing that will fundamentally help this whole industry as we move forward. And again, if farmers are profitable, right? If they have a voice at the table when we deal with carbon management and carbon pricing, if they're part of the policy making, then I think they're a lot more apt to embrace certain policies and things that come forward. So I think I would say that, I think it's okay to say that there's not a single expert here within NC3, for instance, on this topic. I think we're very much focused on that as a emerging space and something that I think NC3 and Extension can really embrace moving into the future.
Yeah, thank you, Aaron, for not being an expert, quote unquote. You did a pretty good job answering that question. So you all know that Aaron Wilson is now the North Central's expert on carbon pricing. So make sure we'll put his email in the thing there.
I'll get that on my CV, Trent. Thanks.
Dennis, you're unmuting now. Do you have something to say?
Yeah, just to follow. Let's try this. Just to follow up on that, and some of you heard me say this before. There is a huge amount of discussion about the economics of this and policy, which I can't comment on policy being part of USDA, but there's a dearth of science being communicated to a number of the people involved. And they don't need to be soil scientists, but they do need to understand a bit more about that prospect. And I think a lot of people do need to understand about that prospect and the issues involved. So this is a good opportunity for a lot of people to be involved in this discussion and for this discussion to happen while the policy plays out and how things work out on the carbon pricing issues.
Yeah, I mean,
go ahead, Hans. Sorry.
I just wanted to add that it's an unregulated market at this point, right? So it's a lot of private industries that are offering different options. And so it makes it difficult for university-based extension people to really become an expert in it. Number one, because we're not allowed to promote any company over another company, right? And number two, there's a new private entity every month, it feels so.
Yeah, so Virgil Schmidt opposed to Wild West, sort of, and that's kind of the way in industry as well, outside of agriculture, it seems to be that way. And just real quick, Aaron's unmuting again. I'll turn it over to him, but Hans did post a link in the chat if you haven't seen it to a discussion or a webinar that Purdue's putting on June 24th that may be relevant to this discussion as well. So, Aaron, did you have something else?
Well, the thought, in trying to connect, different things that we've been talking about back to Dr. Shepard's, comments about being in social media. If you're not there, then that valid information is not getting out there. If we're not playing that, in this ball game, then we're not getting that science-based translatable information to the public, and that's what we need to do, right? We need to be there in order to ensure some science-based, right, policy, science-based information into the decision making that's happening across the Midwest.
And then Julie Dahl posted here the comment about the idea of that, there may be the space, kind of going to Aaron's discussion as well. There may be a space for, comments based on science, science-based metrics or of markets and advice for folks to when it comes to carbon markets and carbon pricing. And so that, this is a good discussion point. I think this is a really great question for Thomas, from Thomas, that this is an ongoing discussion. And I think it's becoming more and more relevant. And sort of, defining a space for extension, even just climate scientists outside of extension, and this can be really important. So, and as Dennis mentioned, as much as none of us want to do this, we would probably need to bring some ag economists to the table. Were there any other comments from? I have ag economist friends and I love them. Were there any other comments from audience or anything like this as well on this topic on carbon markets, which was definitely a good or other topics or questions, points of clarification over the last couple of days, issues that you see, unique perspectives that you may see in your position that we haven't addressed. One in the lacking here, and we have about 10 minutes left of this discussion, but one piece here that and we had Laura had mentioned trying to get perspective from tribal perspective for this discussion as well. But another perspective that we try to get, and I failed miserably on this, is a community-based organization. And especially in some of our larger cities in the region, we do have these neighborhood or community-based organizations that are doing this, on grassroots efforts for climate change mitigation or adaptation to the impacts of things like extreme heat. And so, strategies for reaching out, engaging with those community-based organizations that have organization power that is, more than any of us could ever imagine. It can be challenging from my personal perspective, but also super rewarding when it can work out. So if anybody has any perspectives on that, that would be interesting to see as well. Dennis posted here about training people would like to see. Are there other topics or training that folks would like to see, on sort of in this realm of climate change related to that we haven't touched on? And then to follow up with that, Laura, I'm just flooding everybody with questions here. Laura asking about, what else we interested in hearing about tomorrow. Tomorrow we'll have a, ag and natural resource theme. There'll be discussion. Are there things that folks want to hear about? Last thing, you probably have time for this question. We can discuss this a little bit here. Another question from Thomas, and thank you, Thomas, today for being a source of great questions here. You've made my job a lot easier. So the question is, a lot of data presented county by county level, which can make sense depending on what worlds you're working in. But watersheds cross county lines, cross state lines, cross policy lines. So, especially when it comes to water resources, how can we take a watershed approach? Is that useful? Is it helpful? Is it possible to do a watershed approach at some of these issues versus county level? Laura, go ahead.
Yeah, I think there's some great examples, especially in Iowa with that. And I thought I saw Jamie Benning was on the list earlier. She might be able to better address that too. I know some areas have had really good success with that. Up here in South Dakota, in the big watershed, like upper Missouri River Basin level, there's been some recent success in expanding mesonet and weather observations. But yeah, looking more locally, I think maybe Iowa has some really great examples of that.
I'm promoting Jamie to a panelist in case she wants to participate.
Good idea. So Jamie, you are a panelist and you now have the power of speech. So if there's anything you wanted to say or add to that.
Hi, sorry, I caught just the end of your question, Laura, and my audio kind of blinked out. Could you repeat the full, so I'm making sure I'm responding okay?
Yeah, I believe the question from the audience was, how do you take a watershed approach to cross county lines and kind of use different boundaries in, I'm thinking adaptation or mitigation.
Sure.
I'm not quite sure what he's talking about. Yeah.
Sure. So I guess in describing the watershed approach and how we address, how our county and other administrative boundaries, pretty much never line up with those watershed boundaries is working with farmer leaders in those areas. That's one way, listening to them in terms of areas within those boundaries that farmers tend to congregate. So sometimes that's by a, school district or major community where they tend to gather, and just working along those more social boundaries, I guess you would say. And, for some watersheds that aligns really well. Other times you might have a few subgroups, so we haven't gone too far into, climate adaptation mitigation with that, but I think the same principles would apply in getting people together and, listening to their issues and understanding the values, as we've, heard earlier, in finding that common ground to start your discussion.
Thank you, Jamie, for that perspective here. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up. So Kathy just shared this final slide promoting tomorrow's session, which is going to be another morning of fantastic presentations from great people here. So we'll get started tomorrow, day 3, again at 9 a.m. Central, 8 Mountain, 10 Eastern. The same link will bring you here. With that, I want to thank all of our speakers again. It was great to hear from everybody. Thank you all panelists and audience for what has been a great discussion. Thank you again to everybody, and have a good rest of your afternoon.